My name is Elena Vance, and for 28 years, I was the daughter who lived in the shadows of a perfect family dynamic that I never truly asked for. Growing up in the suburbs of Chicago, my parents, Richard and Martha, viewed life as a series of social performances where appearances were the only currency that mattered. I was the quiet achiever, the one who worked 2 jobs to put myself through law school, while my younger brother Caleb was handed everything on a silver platter because he had the Vance charm. I never begrudged him for it, but I learned early on that my voice only carried weight in the Vance household if it echoed my parents' desires. When I met Julian, a kind-hearted architect who saw me for exactly who I was, I finally felt like I was building a world where I called the shots. But as soon as Julian slipped a ring on my finger, the architecture of my life began to tremble under the weight of my mother's vision. The conflict didn't start with a scream. It started with a spreadsheet. My parents offered to contribute to the wedding, a gesture I initially mistook for genuine support. However, that money came with invisible barbed wire attached to every dollar. Within a week of the engagement, Martha had already booked a country club ballroom that I hated, citing that our backyard intimate idea was beneath the family standing. Every time I tried to suggest a florist or a simple menu, I was met with a sigh and a lecture about how I didn't understand the social obligations of a Vance wedding. Julian and I wanted a celebration of our love, but Richard and Martha were planning a corporate merger disguised as a gala. I was being sidelined in my own story, treated like a guest of honor who had no say in the guest list, the venue, or even the date. The tension reached a boiling point during a mandatory planning brunch at their house. Martha had invited her entire bridge club to the wedding, people I hadn't seen since I was 5, while cutting out Julian's extended family to make room for the people who matter. When I stood up and told her that this was our wedding, not her social debut, the room went arctic. My father didn't even look up from his coffee. He simply told me that as long as they were the ones investing in the event, they would be the ones making the executive decisions. He spoke to me like I was a junior associate at his firm, not his daughter. In that moment, I realized that I wasn't just losing control of a party. I was losing the final shred of respect I had for their role in my life. They weren't supporting me. They were colonizing my future. I left that brunch in tears, but by the time I got home to Julian, the tears had turned into a cold, hard clarity. I realized that the pattern of my entire life, the science fairs they skipped, the graduation dinners where they only talked about Caleb, was repeating itself in the most sacred moment of my adulthood. They expected me to be the invisible bride, a prop in their perfect play. Julian sat me down and told me that he would marry me in a courthouse or a coffee shop as long as it was us making the choice. That's when the idea took root. If my parents wanted to treat my wedding like a business transaction, I would show them exactly what happens when a contract is breached. I wasn't going to argue anymore. I was going to architect a comeback they would never see coming. The transformation from the compliant daughter to the silent architect happened overnight. I realized that my parents, Richard and Martha, weren't just planning a wedding. They were using my life as a stage for their own social validation in our Chicago suburb. Every conversation felt like a negotiation where I had no leverage. They had already sent out "save the dates" to a list of 300 people, half of whom I didn't know, and the other half I didn't like. My own friends were being pushed to the overflow list, and Julian's family from out of state was being treated like an afterthought. My father's comment about his investment giving him executive power was the final straw. He thought he could buy my silence and my submission. What he didn't realize was that I had spent years in law school learning exactly how to dismantle a bad contract. Julian and I spent that Sunday evening sitting on our living room floor, surrounded by the floral arrangements and catering menus my mother had forced upon us. We looked at each other and realized that if we walked down that aisle, we wouldn't be celebrating our union. We would be celebrating my parents' bank account. I told Julian my plan, expecting him to be hesitant, but he just smiled and said, "I'd marry you in a rainstorm as long as they weren't the ones holding the umbrella." That was all the permission I needed. I didn't argue. I didn't send angry texts. I didn't even tell them I was upset. Instead, I became perfectly, terrifyingly agreeable. I let my mother pick the lila I hated. I let my father finalize the seating chart that put my best friend in the back corner. I played the role of the submissive bride perfectly, all while I was gathering every piece of data I needed. I gained access to my mother's wedding planning email account under the guise of helping with the RSVPs. She was so thrilled that I was finally coming to my senses that she gave me the password without a second thought. I spent 3 nights meticulously exporting the contact information for every single person on that guest list. I had their emails, their home addresses, and their phone numbers. My parents thought they held the keys to the kingdom because they were writing the checks, but I held the map to the kingdom's people. While Martha was busy bragging to her bridge club about the Vance wedding of the century, I was drafting a very different kind of announcement. I felt a strange sense of calm as I typed out the words. It wasn't malice. It was a reclamation of my own life. On a Tuesday evening, exactly 3 months before the big day, I hit send. Using a professional mass mailing tool to ensure nothing went to spam, I sent an official-looking update to all 300 guests. The subject line was Urgent Vance Holloway Wedding Update. The body of the email was brief and professional. It stated that due to unforeseen circumstances, the wedding of Elena Vance and Julian Holloway had been canceled. It thanked them for their excitement but requested that they cancel any travel arrangements or hotel bookings immediately. I watched the sent folder climb from 10 to 100 to 300. In the digital world, my parents' investment vanished in a matter of seconds. I closed the laptop, felt the weight lift off my chest, and for the first time in months, I slept through the entire night. With the digital slate wiped clean, Julian and I didn't waste a single second. While my parents were busy admiring the expensive centerpieces they'd picked out for a wedding that on paper no longer had any guests, we were building our real celebration from the ground up. We didn't need a country club or a 3-tiered cake steeped in passive aggression. We booked a beautiful, historic loft in downtown Chicago, a space with exposed brick and massive windows that overlooked the city skyline. It was raw, it was honest, and it was entirely ours. I reached out to my actual friends, the people who had seen me cry over my mother's dismissive comments, and the colleagues who had covered my shifts so I could study for the bar. I sent them new, private invitations with a password-protected digital RSVP. I told them the truth. The Vance Gala was a ghost. And they were invited to the Holloway Vance Union. The silence from my parents' house was deafening, but it was a silence I had carefully manufactured. I knew they wouldn't find out about the mass email for a few days. Most of their friends were the type to wait for a formal invitation anyway, and those who did call were met with my mother's assistant or went to voicemail because Martha was too busy with the prestigious planning. I continued to attend the weekly check-ins at their house, nodding as they discussed the premium open bar and the string quartet they'd hired to play songs I'd never heard of. It felt surreal, like watching a movie of my own life where I was the only person who knew the ending. My father even joked about how smoothly everything was going now that I'd stopped being difficult. I just smiled and sipped my water, knowing that in 72 hours, the walls of their carefully constructed reality were going to crumble. The climb for me during those weeks wasn't just about planning a secret wedding. It was about the internal shift of realizing I didn't need their approval to be happy. For years, I had measured my worth by how much I could minimize myself to fit into their grand plans. Now, every vendor I booked the local taco truck instead of the 5-course French meal. The indie playlist instead of the quartet felt like a brick being laid in a new foundation. Julian was my rock, helping me navigate the logistics of the 2 weddings, the fake one my parents were funding and the real one we were living. We weren't just planning a party. We were setting a boundary that would define the rest of our lives. We were moving our things into a new apartment, changing our emergency contacts, and slowly untangling our existence from the Vance executive influence. Then the first crack appeared. One of my mother's oldest friends, Mrs. Gable, ran into Martha at a boutique and mentioned how sorry she was to hear the news. Martha, confused, asked what she meant. Mrs. Gable explained that she'd received the cancellation email days ago and had already booked a cruise for that weekend since she was no longer expected in Chicago. I wasn't there to see the look on my mother's face, but I heard about it later from a cousin who happened to be nearby. The confusion turned into a frantic scramble. By the time I got home that evening, I had 17 missed calls from my father and 24 texts from my mother. The game was up. The silence was over. And the confrontation I had been preparing for my entire life was finally knocking at my door. I didn't feel afraid. I felt ready. The storm didn't just break. It demolished the front door. By the time I arrived at my parents' house that evening, the air in the foyer was vibrating with my mother's frantic energy. Richard was pacing the length of the Persian rug, his face a shade of crimson I had never seen before. Martha was clutching her phone like a lifeline, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "Elena! Thank God you're here!" She shrieked before I could even set my keys down. Some hacker, some monster accessed my email. They sent a cancellation notice to everyone. Mrs. Gable, the Johnsons, even your father's boss. We've been on the phone for 4 hours trying to tell people it's a mistake. But the country club says 10 people already canceled their catering headcount. She looked at me, waiting for me to join her in her panic, waiting for her obedient daughter to start fixing the mess. I didn't move. I didn't offer a hug or a word of comfort. I simply stood by the door, watching them realize that I wasn't reacting the way they expected. The silence stretched between us until it became heavy and suffocating. My father stopped pacing and narrowed his eyes at me. He was a man who prided himself on reading people in boardrooms, and for the first time in my life, he was actually looking at me. "Elena," he said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous register he used when a junior associate messed up a filing. "You don't look surprised. In fact, you look like you knew this was coming." I took a deep breath, feeling the cool Chicago air from the open door behind me. "I didn't just know it was coming, Dad," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the tremor that usually lived there. "I'm the one who sent the email. The explosion I expected didn't happen right away. Instead, there was a terrifying vacuum-like stillness." Martha's phone slipped from her hand and landed on the rug with a dull thud. "You... what?" she whispered, her voice cracking. I stepped further into the room, reclaiming the space that had always felt like a cage. "I canceled your wedding," I told them. "I canceled the gala, the country club, the Layla, and the guest list full of strangers. I canceled the Vance performance because I'm not an investment, and I'm not a prop in your social theater. You told me that since you were paying, you had the executive power. Well, consider this my resignation from the firm." I watched the realization wash over them, the realization that they had pushed the quiet daughter too far, and she had finally pushed back. Then the rage came. My father began shouting about the thousands of dollars in non-refundable deposits, about the embarrassment of having to explain this to his colleagues, about how ungrateful and spiteful I was being. He called me a child who didn't understand the real world. My mother started crying, but they weren't tears for me. They were tears for the reputation she had spent 30 years building. "How could you do this to us?" she wailed. I looked her directly in the eye and said, "I didn't do this to you. I did this for me." Julian and I are getting married this weekend at a loft downtown. Our friends will be there. His family will be there. And for the first time, I will be the bride, not a Vance family accessory. I turned to leave, but my father's voice stopped me. "If you walk out that door," he hissed, "don't expect a dime from us ever again. You are dead to this family." I didn't even look back as I replied, "Dad, I've been dead to this family for years. I'm just finally stopping the funeral." The Saturday of our wedding arrived not with the frantic, high-pitched energy of my mother's planning, but with a deep, soulful quiet. The loft downtown was bathed in the soft, amber glow of the Chicago sunset, the light bouncing off the exposed brick, and the simple glass vases filled with wildflowers. There were no string quartets or forced social hierarchies. Instead, there was the sound of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the genuine warmth of 50 people who actually knew our middle names. Julian stood at the end of the aisle, looking at me not as a Vance bride, but as Elena, the woman who had finally found the courage to stand on her own 2 feet. When we exchanged our vows, they weren't scripted by a consultant. They were promises forged in the fire of the last few months. We weren't just joining our lives. We were declaring our independence. My parents did not attend. They spent that Saturday fielding confused phone calls from the country club and trying to explain to their social circle why the event of the season had vanished into thin air. I later heard from Caleb that my father had stayed in his study all day, refusing to speak to anyone, while my mother obsessively checked social media for any sign of our real ceremony. But they found nothing because I had asked our guests to keep the moment private. I didn't want their eyes on my joy. I didn't want their judgment to touch the one thing they couldn't buy. For the first time in 28 years, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't looking over my shoulder to see if I was performing correctly. I was just living. The reception was a celebration of everything my parents had deemed unacceptable. We had the taco truck parked outside, the smell of cilantro and lime wafting through the open windows. We danced to indie rock and old soul records, and my best friend gave a toast that made me cry because it was about my resilience, not my family's standing. There was no golden child or underdog that night. There was only a community of people who saw me for who I was. As the night wound down and the city lights began to twinkle outside the massive loft windows, Julian leaned in and whispered, "We did it," and he was right. We hadn't just pulled off a wedding. We had pulled off a rescue mission for my own soul. I had lost a family of blood, but I had gained a family of choice. And the trade was worth every penny of my father's investment. In the weeks that followed, the silence from my parents continued, but it no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like peace. I realized that by trying to take over my wedding, they had given me the greatest gift of all, the push I needed to finally walk away from their shadow. I am Elena Holloway now, a woman who defines her own success and plans her own future. My life is no longer a performance, and my joy is no longer a corporate merger. To anyone out there who feels like a guest in their own life, remember that you hold the pen to the guest list. You have the right to cancel any version of yourself that doesn't feel real. Sometimes the best way to find your voice is to hit send on the truth and never look back. If this story of standing up for yourself resonated with you, or if you've ever had to set a hard boundary with the people you love, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your courage might just be the inspiration someone else needs today. To stay updated with more stories of justice, boundaries, and reclaiming your power, make sure to join our community here at Silent Revenge Lab. Like this video if you believe in choosing yourself, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Thank you for being part of this journey with me.